A bully does not need everyone to agree with them. They need an audience. They need people who laugh at the joke, people who forward the headline, people who sit in the meeting, see exactly what happened, and then go back to their inbox. And before you decide that this episode is not about you, I want you to stay with me. Maybe no one is bullying you at work. Maybe you would never call yourself a bully. But maybe you manage someone who's starting to disappear in front of you, and you're calling it a personality conflict. Maybe you've watched somebody get humiliated in a meeting and told yourself you were too busy to get involved. Maybe someone you love keeps saying work is making them sick, and you have not known what to do with that information. What you learned today may help someone protect their job, their health, or their life. So yes, this episode is about work, but it's also about what happens when harm is happening in public and everyone else is deciding whether to look away. It may help you recognize what's happening. It may help you act sooner. It may help you understand the moment when silence stops becoming neutral. Bullies need an audience, and without us, they lose their power. Welcome to Leadership, Law, and Lightwork. I'm Marcia Narayan Weldon. This is the show where we study how the brain, the body, and belief patterns shape the way you lead, decide, and show up when it really matters. Each week, you'll get the Leadership Lab, the brief, the legal blind spot, and the toolkit take. And make sure to stay with me to the end of this episode. I made something I think that you're going to want, and I'll tell you about how to get it at the close of the episode. Let's get started with the Leadership Lab. We at least have a public script for school bullying. We've got hotlines, we've got school assemblies, we've got policies, state laws. Parents might still struggle, and schools may still fail children, but most people at least understand that bullying at school is supposed to trigger some sort of response. Now answer this question. What are you supposed to do if you're being bullied at work? And in most states, the answer is very little that you can do. Workplace bullying is legal almost everywhere in this country. And even though the person doing it is usually your boss, in almost 30% of the cases, it's actually a colleague. And here's what it costs you if you're the target. The 2024 Workplace Bullying Institute survey found that almost a third of working Americans have been bullied at work. That's 52 million workers. 62% of those targets lose their job. The target loses their job. The health damage is documented: sleep disruption, depression, anxiety, and in most extreme cases, suicide. Here's what costs you if you're running the company. Workplace bullying drives turnover, absenteeism, disengagement, healthcare costs, lost productivity, and litigation exposure. The bullies' individual numbers may look fine on paper, but the damage they cause doesn't show up on their performance review. It shows up on everyone else's. So we've spent years telling students and children that bullying deserves a response. Then we send adults into workplaces where the rules are far murkier. The power dynamics are a lot more complicated, and silence often protects the person causing the harm. So this is what I want to talk about in this week's Leadership Lab. So most leaders think about bullying as the problem of the bully. Find the bully, fire the bully, problem solved. That's incomplete. The harder question is what the rest of us do when a bully's in the room. So let me set this up with a story. For years, I assigned a TED Talk to my law students. The talk was Amy Cuddy's Fake It Till You Make It. Cuddy is a social psychologist behind one of two of the most watched TED Talks of all time. She gave her first one in 2012. And the central message was the body knows how powerful and confident you feel, especially when we feel powerless. I've had students tell me that watching her talk changed how they walked into job interviews. I've had coaching clients tell me it changed how they walked into rooms when they didn't believe they belonged. So every year, I'd assign it or recommend it. Before the mock interviews, before moot court, before anything that scared them. Then the press started reporting that Cuddy's work had been debunked. And I want to be honest with you. I will stop sharing the talk. I started prefacing it with little disclaimers when I assigned it. Some people say this has been challenged, so take this with a grain of salt, and I was hedging. And the only reason I kept showing the talk is that my students kept telling me it was helping them. The actual humans in front of me kept reporting that it worked, so I kept recommending it. But I felt a little embarrassed every time I did. Then 2 weeks ago, I sat in the audience at TED 2026 in Vancouver and watched Amy Cuddy walk back onto the stage and tell the rest of the story. She revealed that the public story was incomplete. The headlines that many of us absorbed didn't really capture that full picture. Felt powerless, and she felt powerless in a way that the debunked label hadn't suggested. What happened to her was something totally different. It was a sustained bullying campaign carried out over years, A tenured professor posted a public call on a blog asking people to find something wrong with her research. He said, I wish I could find it was crappy and I could mock it, so maybe some of you can help me out. Her name appeared on that blog more than 600 times. And when the New York Times asked that professor why he never just reached out to Cuddy directly, he said, I don't like interpersonal conflict. Sit with that for a second. He led a multi-year public campaign against another professor's career, and he told a reporter that he doesn't like interpersonal conflict. Sound familiar? I bet it does, because you have seen this move at work. Someone avoids the direct conversation and performs the conflict somewhere else. It's in the hallway, it's on Slack, it's in the group text, maybe the meeting after the meeting, the anonymous feedback, the performance review that person never saw coming and blindsided them. He described what those years cost her. And I want to say this really carefully because this part is heavy. She described 2 suicide attempts. She walked away from Harvard a year before going up for tenure. 2 collaborators of hers ended up in the psychiatric treatment programs. So I want you to absorb this because this is the lesson I came home with that I want to share with you. She said bullies need an audience. They need accessory bullies who amplify the attacks. They need passive bystanders who watch and stay silent. Because without that audience, the bully has no power. And I had to be honest with myself when I was listening to her, because I have been a passive bystander. I was influenced by that smear campaign, and I didn't know it was a smear campaign that was happening. I didn't see it. I just absorbed the headlines and I started hedging. And that's how it works. I didn't do any additional research. The campaign didn't need me to participate actively. It just needed me to take the narrative in, and I did. So let's make this concrete for you, because that distant version of bystander problem is the easy one to recognize. The closer version is the meeting you sat in last Tuesday, the one where your colleague got cut off, talked over, dismissed. You noticed it, you knew it was happening, and you didn't say anything in the moment. You didn't check in with that person afterwards. You went back to your inbox. That's the proximate bystander, and that's where most of us live. We're the people in the room who saw it, and we stayed silent. Cuddy's gift to those of us on that TED stage was to name what that silence costs. She said something else. She said, we will never win by bullying the bullies, because as soon as we adopt that bully's worldview, the world is hostile and you have to dominate or be dominated. And we evaluate that worldview that produces the bullying in the first place. So the way out is not more aggression. It's something that she called collective social bravery. Small acts, stepping in, distributed among enough people so the bully can no longer have the audience that they need. So a 2018 study published in the journal Science by Damon Canola, the University of Pennsylvania, looked at how many committed people you need to flip a group norm. The answer was 25%. Below that threshold, the old norm held. Above it, the group flipped. So you don't need everyone. You don't need a majority. You just need about a quarter of the room. And this finding matters because most leaders think that they have to convince everyone before they can change the culture. Most leaders give up too early because the early resistance feels overwhelming and it feels like the path to majority feels impossible. Research says that that's the wrong target. The target is 25%. And once you can get there, the rest can follow. So some of you listening have formal power. You run the meeting. You decide who gets heard. You know when the room has gone silent because people are managing you instead of telling you the truth. Now, some of you don't have that kind of title. You might be newer, younger, outside the inner circle, or you're just tired of spending political capital you're not even sure you have. Either way, you still count, because that 25% rule applies to all of you, just differently. If you have positional power, your silence carries more weight than other people's silence. It tells the room what's acceptable. And your speaking up carries more weight too, which means that you may count more than one toward the critical mass. If you don't have positional power, you still count, because that 25% doesn't require seniority. It requires your presence. Every person who refuses to be the audience to the bully is the one step closer to that tipping point. So here's what I want you to do this week. Notice that bystander moment. The colleague who gets cut off, the team member whose idea gets attributed to somebody else 2 minutes after they said it, the person who's being subtly excluded from the meetings where the decisions get made. Just notice. In at least one of those moments, do something. Say the person's name. Reattribute the idea to them. Ask the dismissed colleague what they think. You don't have to make a speech. Don't worry. You just have to refuse to be that audience that the bully needs. That's leadership. The willingness to spend the social capital you have to protect the people who don't have as much. So here's the question to carry into the week. The next time you witness something in a meeting that you know is wrong, are you going to be in the 75% that holds the old norm or the 25% that flips it? By the way, this episode is brought to you by Illuminating Wisdom, where I help leaders, lawyers, founders, and high achievers build the capacity to lead, decide, and communicate under pressure. Now let me bring this into the brief, because there's a book that gives you the actual language for what to do once you decide to be in the 25%. And that book is Radical Respect by Kim Scott. I talked about Kim Scott in episode 38 when I covered her earlier book, Radical Candor. That's the 2017 book on giving honest feedback at work. And Radical Respect came out of it in May in 2024, in what she calls the prequel. And here's what you need to know about this book. She'd actually already written it. She published it in 2021 just under a different title called Just Work. And then she did something that almost no successful author does. She watched teams put the book into practice, decided it was too long and too unfocused to be useful, pulled it back, cut more than 40,000 words, and reorganized it to what leaders should do, and republished it years later as Radical Respect. Now think about that for a second, because there's a lesson before we even get to the content of the book. How many times have you watched a leader keep pushing a strategy that isn't working because admitting it isn't working would mean that they were wrong? How many times have you done that yourself? The thing that worked 5 years ago isn't working now, and the cost of saying so out loud feels higher than the cost of pretending. Scott did the harder thing. She pulled back her own published book. So the version you can buy today is the version she got right on the second try. And that's intellectual honesty, and that's what it looks like in public, and it's rare. So the reason she rewrote it is the same reason she wrote it in the first place. So after Radical Candor came out, she was giving a talk at a tech company in San Francisco. The CEO of that company is a black woman Scott had worked with for the better part of a decade. And after the talk, the CEO pulled her aside and told her that Radical Candor was harder to roll out for her than it would be for Scott. Because every time she gave even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, someone called her the angry black woman. And that conversation changed the way Scott understood her own work. She realized that she had failed to be an upstander while someone she cared about was being silenced. She also had to face the time she'd been harmed, the time she had caused harm, and the way she had failed as a leader to prevent it on her own teams. So those are the 4 roles she works with in the book: upstander, harmed, culprit, and leader. Now, most of us move through more than one of those roles over the course of a career, and some of us through more of those roles in the same week. So here's the lesson before we go further. The leadership move is recognizing which role you're in and the moment you're in it. We get into trouble when we're absolutely certain we're the upstander and absolutely certain we're not the culprit. So Scott's confession is that she was both, sometimes in the same week, and she had to face that before she could write a useful book about it. So what makes this book work is what she does next. She takes that giant, paralyzing concept of disrespect at work and breaks it into pieces that you can actually do something about. And she calls it a taxonomy. Not a taxonomy. She invented a new word. So her 3 core focuses are bias, prejudice, and bullying. Bias is not meaning it. It's unconscious. It's the colleague that sits next to everybody else except for you in the conference room. Prejudice is meaning it. It's a consciously held belief, usually trapped in a stereotype. And bullying is just being mean. There's no belief behind it. It's just the instinct to dominate. So each one calls for a different response. Bias gets an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. It holds up a mirror. Prejudice gets an it statement. It's illegal. It's an HR violation. It's not okay. It draws a line. And bullying gets a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. Bullying pushes you to absorb something. The you statement pushes back. There's a lesson in the framework itself. Most of us are responding to all 3 of these the same way. We try to talk it out. We give grace. We assume good intent. And Scott is telling us that response only works for one of the 3. Bias. Bias responds to grace. Prejudice doesn't, and bullying definitely doesn't. So using the wrong response on the wrong problem is why many of us walk away from these conversations more frustrated than when we actually walked in. When power layers on top of these 3, they become discrimination, harassment, and even physical. That's the part of the taxonomy where the law gets involved. And it's what I'm going to dig into in a minute in the legal blind spot. So there's another moment I want you to pay special attention to, especially because of the Amy Cuddy story I started with. Scott admits that she's been a bully too. She tells a story about recording a podcast with her former co-founder, Russ Laraway. And Russ corrected her on something politely and accurately, and Scott shut him down with a joke about his masculinity. The actual line was, "Russ, you were born doing a power pose." And the room laughed, but Russ got quiet. Given everything we've been talking about with Amy Cuddy, it's the irony of that line. It's really hard to miss. She thought she was being clever. The listener later wrote in and called her out on it. And when Scott went back to Russ and asked what had happened from his perspective, he told her the truth. It was a slapdown to him, and it shut him up for the rest of that recording. Scott's gift to the rest of us is that she looked back at her own behavior and called it what it was. So for leaders, she offers what she calls bias disruptors, a 3-step team practice. Build a shared vocabulary for naming bias when it shows up. Build a shared norm for how to receive that naming without melting down or getting defensive. And build a shared community to actually doing it, because the practice is awkward. And if it's awkward, people will stop if they don't commit. For bullying, she talks about 3 categories of consequences. Conversational consequences in the moment. Compensation consequences where the bullies don't get bonuses. And career consequences where bullies don't get promoted. And if they can't change, they get fired. As Scott says, and this is one of the funniest things she says, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. And I want you to read the book because it gives you the language you need. Most of us will walk into hard rooms without the vocabulary for what's happening, and we walk out feeling crazy or guilty or both. Radical respect gives you words you can actually use. Bias, prejudice, bullying, I statements, it statements, you statements, and the 4 roles she asks us to examine. When you have those words, you can see the moves. And once you see the moves, you make different ones. So the link to buy Radical Respect is in the show notes. Now let's turn to the legal blind spot. This segment is sponsored by Legally Lucid. AI gives you the answers you think are correct. Templates give you the documents you think are complete. Peers give you the shortcut that makes you feel safe. And lawyers give advice if you know what to ask and you have the budget. Legally Lucid helps business owners know what to check before a business decision becomes an expensive mistake. Go to legallylucid.com to learn more. On to the legal blind spot. A few words on where I'm coming from before I get into this, because it matters from what I'm about to say. I've been an employment lawyer for nearly 30 years. I worked as outside counsel in a major firm. I've worked in-house at a Fortune 500 company. I've been the head of HR for a division. I get hired as outside counsel when companies investigations or somebody independent. I teach employment law. And I was appointed by the Secretary of Labor to serve on the Whistleblower Protection Advisory Committee in the Obama administration. So I sat at almost every table where workplace bullying has been discussed. I've also had to say some version of this sentence to too many people. What's happening to you is real. It's harmful. And unfortunately, it may not give you a lawsuit you can win. Some of you have been on the other side of that conversation. Some of you are thinking about somebody you love. And some of you are realizing the thing you've been minimizing may have a name. Workplace bullying is one of the most common complaints I hear about. It's also one of the least understood problems because most people assume there's a workplace bullying law in this country. And in most places, for most workers, there isn't. And that's the gap. So let's talk about what workplace bullying is and isn't. The Workplace Bullying Institute defines bullying as repeated, health-harming mistreatment by one or more employees of an employee. It can include verbal abuse, threatening or humiliating behavior, work sabotage, or some combination of those. I gave you some of the prevalence numbers earlier in the episode. And a few more matters here. Again, a majority of bullies are bosses, although co-workers could be bullies too. Much of the bullying happens between members of the same gender. And a striking percentage of Americans across the political spectrum support a law against workplace bullying. That's Democrats, Republicans, Independents. That tells you something. People know this is a problem, but the law has not caught up with the lived experience. This doesn't only happen in conference rooms anymore. In remote and hybrid workspaces, bullying can happen through Slack, Teams, email, shared documents, calendar invites, or the lack of the invite, access permissions, video meetings. If the pattern is exclusion, humiliation, work sabotage, or intimidation, the fact that it happened through a screen doesn't make it any less real. So where does this leave you? Workplace bullying is usually actionable only when the underlying conduct fits into an existing legal category. Example, it's tied to race, sex, age, disability, religion, national origin, or another protected category under federal, state, or local law. And then it may be harassment or discrimination. If the bullying happens after somebody complains about discrimination, reports misconduct, reports safety concerns, requests a legally protected leave, or engages in some other protected activity, the legal issue may be retaliation. If someone spreads false factual statements that damage your reputation, defamation might be the cause of action. If there's physical contact, threats, or intimidation, other legal theories may come into play. If the conduct is extreme enough or causes serious emotional harm, there may be a claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress, although that is a very high bar to come over. So that's why the sentence, my boss is bullying me or my boss is mean, is usually the beginning of the legal analysis, not the end. What exactly happened? Who did it? Why did it happen? What's the evidence? what protected rights may be involved, what policies apply, what harm can be documented. There's the equal opportunity jerk problem. And this is something that surprises people when I do trainings. A boss can be a jerk to everyone and still create enormous damage inside an organization. He can yell at women, men, younger employees, older employees, white employees, black employees, purple employees, senior people, junior people, everybody. That may make him a terrible manager. It may make him a cultural hazard. It may make him a walking retention problem. It may make people physically sick. It may violate company policy. But under federal discrimination law and most state law, the legal question is usually whether the conduct happened because of a protected characteristic or because someone engaged in protected activity. If the evidence shows that the boss is awful to everyone, the legal claim becomes a lot harder. This is again called the equal opportunity jerk problem. And some courts have even described this as the equal opportunity harasser problem. And that's the part that I and then most people find maddening. The law gives employers a way to say, essentially, he treats everybody badly, so this is not discrimination. From a human perspective, of course, that sounds ridiculous. From a culture perspective, it's dangerous. But from a legal perspective, it can matter. And that's one reason that workplace bullying sits in such a frustrating gap. The conduct can be real. The harm can be serious. The body can be effective. Careers can be derailed. And still, the legal system may not give the target a clean claim. That doesn't mean the conduct's acceptable. It means leaders can't wait for the law to define the floor of human decency in their workplace. Here's what's still worth knowing. Bullying that's not legally actionable is often still against company policy, so pull out your employee handbook if you can find it. Look at the anti-harassment policy, the code of conduct, the respectful workplace policy, complaint procedures, ethics policies, retaliation policies, performance management procedures. Many companies prohibit conduct that the law may not independently prohibit, and that matters. If you're the target, the company policy may give you a path to report what's happening. If you're the employer, your company policy may create expectations about what you're supposed to do once you know what's happening. And if you're the leader who think this is merely a personality issue, be careful. Personality issues don't usually drive people to document everything, seek medical care, transfer departments, quit jobs, call lawyers, or warn other people not to work for you. Workplace bullying is not just a people problem, it is a risk signal. A word on gaslighting. A lot of people who come to me describe workplace bullying using the word gaslighting. Let's talk about that, because a lot of workplaces don't handle it well. The word comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, one of my favorite movies, where a husband systematically tries to convince his wife she's losing her mind so he can institutionalize her and take her money. He denies anything that she says. He moves objects in the house and tells her she imagined it. He dismisses her concerns as symptoms of a fragile mind. By the end of the film, she's genuinely uncertain whether she's even sane. That is gaslighting. In a workplace, this shows up in 5 different patterns, at least 5. Denial. Your boss says that the meeting didn't happen the way you remembered it. Shifting goalposts. Project requirements or deadlines change after you've already met them, and somehow that becomes your fault for not anticipating it. Undermining. Your accomplishments are trivialized. Your concerns are dismissed because you're too sensitive, you're too emotional, you're too dramatic, you're not strategic enough. False accusations. You're blamed for mistakes you didn't make or your work product described in performance reviews in ways you don't even recognize. Isolation. You're excluded from meetings and communications and later told you were always included. Maybe you missed the email. Here's what you need to know. Gaslighting usually isn't a separate legal claim by itself, just like bullying isn't. You don't usually walk into court and sue for gaslighting as its own standalone cause of action. But the underlying conduct, if documented, can become evidence. It might support a harassment claim, a retaliation claim, a constructive discharge, emotional distress claim, a policy violation, or an internal complaint. The pattern itself may not be the legal claim. It may be the evidence that helps people understand what's happening. And this is why documentation matters so much. Because gaslighting works by erasing your record of what happened. A dated note to your personal email at the end of the day may help. A follow-up email summarizing what was said in the meeting. Send a text to a trusted person after that meeting ends. Have a private chronology of dates, witnesses, words used, and the impact on your body. That record protects your sanity before it ever protects a legal claim. So now I want to tell you something that I haven't actually publicly talked about before. I've lived through this as the target. Some years ago, I was working with a client organization, and I challenged a leader there about something I felt really strongly about. He didn't like that. And from that point forward, the relationship totally changed. His team loved working with me. Other people in that organization praised my work. I was actually getting referrals from inside the company to people outside the company. The results were measurable and lasting, and the positive feedback outweighed the negative by literally 20. But this one leader wanted to only talk about the negative. He never had anything positive to say. Over time, even with all the evidence in front of me, I started to doubt my own work and wonder if I was the problem. The thing that broke that spell was a conversation with another woman. She'd worked for that same organization. She had been asked to prove her methodologies the same way I had, even the same language. She'd been treated the same selective focus on the negative. Same pattern, same playbook, different woman. And that was the moment I understood that what was happening to me was gaslighting. And once I could name it, I couldn't unsee it. I used to have to mentally prepare myself for every meeting with this leader. I had to mentally prepare myself just to even open his emails. Working with him and thinking about him made me physically sick, so I left. I wouldn't have called it bullying back then, but I do now. So this is a lawyer who's telling you that I left a job because of what bullying did to me and my body. So the good news is that there's some renewed legislative efforts around workplace bullying all over the United States. And in many countries, bullying is already illegal. So there's some state bills that are being pending. Some involve mandates for training, psychological safety, stronger limits on confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions. So I'm going to put resources in the show notes so you can see where things stand and where your state may be headed. For today, I want you to remember this. Even when the law is incomplete, leaders are not helpless, employees are not crazy, and organizations are not required to tolerate cruelty until a court says this is illegal. So what can you do if you're the one being bullied? Number one, start by documenting what's happening. Use your personal email or your personal notes, not your work email. Write down the date, who was involved, what happened, who witnessed it, and the impact on you. This written record is important. One caution, though. Documentation does not mean secretly recording people without understanding the law in your state. That's illegal in many states. It also doesn't mean downloading confidential company files, client files, patient information, student records, trade secrets, or privileged information. Protect your record, but don't create a new problem while you're trying to prove the old one. And if there are threats, physical intimidation, stalking, weapons, physical contact, credible fear of violence, treat that as an immediate safety issue. Documentation matters, but documentation is not a substitute for getting help. Then find one person you trust. Bullying isolates you. That's how it works. You need at least one person to know what is happening. Read your company's policies before you decide you're just stuck living with it. Look at the anti-harassment policy, the code of conduct, respectful workplace policy, whatever it's called, the complaint processes, the retaliation language. And if what's happening touches a protected category, retaliation, threats, physical contact, your leave, whistleblowing, or false statements, talk to an employment lawyer in your state. And please, please take your body seriously. If work is making you sick, get medical care. Talk to a therapist. Tell a doctor what's happening. You may need those records later, but even if you never use them for anything legal, your health matters right now. And at some point, you might need to locate the nearest exit. That doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes leaving is the first sane decision after months of trying to survive an insane situation. There are going to be more resources in the show notes, and I'll tell you about a specific tool I built for this at the end of the episode. What if you're the company leader? If you're running the company, leading the team, managing the department, or advising the organization, don't wait till somebody hands you a perfect legal claim with a bow. Have a standalone anti-bullying policy that's a real document written in plain language that defines bullying and makes it grounds for discipline, even when the conduct doesn't fit into a legal claim. Train your managers on bullying behavior, including conduct that's corrosive but not technically illegal. In some jurisdictions, by the way, that's legally required. Most managers freeze when an employee reports something harmful that doesn't look like a textbook harassment claim that they've already been trained about. Teach them how to take it seriously anyway, and create the consequences that matter. Remember, Kim Scott talks about conversational, compensation, and career consequences in Radical Respect, which I covered earlier. In plain English, bullies should be corrected, not rewarded. They should not be promoted because their numbers look good while everyone around them pays the price. Audit your confidentiality and non-disparagement language. The law in this area has changed, especially around sexual harassment, sexual assault, and several states have gone further. If your templates are old, have them reviewed. And watch your high performers. Some of the most damaging bullies are protected because they produce revenue, win cases, keep clients, or they know where the bodies are buried. And that's short-term thinking. The bullies' numbers may look good, but the organizational damage shows up somewhere else. And that concludes the legal blind spot. Now on to the toolkit take. We just spent this whole episode talking about what bullying does and what the law can and can't do about it. I want to give you something you can do. Here's the practice. It's got two parts. You can do part 1 or part 2 or both. Both work. Both interrupt the same problem. Part 1. If you witness something at work recently, bias, prejudice, or bullying, send a single text or email to the person who is on the receiving end of it. Better yet, pick up the phone or walk over to that person's office. And you can keep it very simple. Option 1. I saw what happened in the meeting today, and that was not okay. Option 2. I saw what happened in the meeting today. I'm sorry I didn't speak up in the moment. That's it. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to strategize. You don't have to turn it into a 3-hour conversation. You just have to refuse to be the person who saw it, said nothing, and walked away pretending it didn't happen. Believe me, that will help, even that. If you're the person it's happening to, and this is part 2, take out your phone or open a notebook and write down one specific thing that happened to you most recently. Just the facts. Write down the date, who was there, what was said or done, or what wasn't done, the impact it had on you, and then label it. Use the framework I taught you earlier in the brief. Was this bias? Remember, bias is unconscious. The colleague who doesn't realize she's interrupting everybody at the table. Was this prejudice? Prejudice is conscious, the belief wrapped up in a stereotype. Or was this bullying? Bullying is that instinct to dominate, and there's no belief behind it. It's just meanness with intention. Same incident, but different labels, different response required. That's the point of the framework that Kim Scott talks about. You can't respond to what you can't name. And here's why this practice matters more than any emotional regulation tool I could give you today. Bullying works by erasure. The target loses access to her own perception. Gaslighting accelerates that erasure. So the single most powerful counter to erasure is a written record of what happened in your own words with the structure to name it. And that witness move I talked about, the text of the person who was on the receiving end, that's one of the most underused tools in any workplace. The 2024 Workplace Bullying Institute survey found that only 2% of coworkers ever intervene. The bar to be a 2%er is so low it's basically on the floor. So you can start with one text, send the text, make the phone call. So your question to carry you into the week, who in your life this week saw something they should have named and stayed silent? Now flip the question. Where did you do the same? If you can answer either of those honestly, you know where to start tomorrow. Remember, most of us are not bullies. Most of us are the audience that the bully needs. Before I let you go, I need to say this clearly. If anything in this episode has brought up something heavy for you, please seek help. And if you're thinking of self-harm, episode 31 of this podcast is there for you. I sat down with Jenny Thrasher to talk about what we get wrong about suicide. If you're in crisis right now, please call or text 988, 24 hours a day for free in the United States. You do not have to be alone with this. And one more thing. I told you at the top of the episode to stay with me to the end. So thank you. And here's your gift. I built the Workplace Bullying Field Guide for you. Now, it is not a comprehensive legal guide. It is not a substitute for therapy, medical care, HR advice, or talking to a lawyer in your jurisdiction. It's just a place to get started. The guide includes a documentation template I described in this episode. It lays out common gaslighting techniques so you can name what's happening, and includes 5 exercises from my upcoming Illuminated Wisdom Toolkit for what bullying does to the body. And it has sections for 3 different groups: the people who may be the target, the people who may have witnessed something and stayed silent, and the leaders who suspect bullying is happening on their team. And there's a section for the harder conversation with people who may recognize themselves in some of the behavior I described today. You can get the Workplace Bullying Field Guide at illuminatingwisdom.com/bullying. That's illuminatingwisdom.com/bullying, and it's free. Put your email in, and the guide will come straight to your inbox. You'll start receiving my weekly Wednesday newsletter from Illuminating Wisdom as well. And if you don't like my weekly words of wisdom, you can always just unsubscribe. So if this episode helped you, share it with one person who needs to hear it. And if something landed, please leave a comment if the platform you're listening to or watching this podcast on allows it. Or just email me directly at marcia@illuminatingwisdom.com. I read every email and every comment, and I really want to hear from you. Now take what you learned today and let it shape how you lead, how you choose, and how you move through the world. I'll see you next time.